We're starting the technical sessions now, and the first session is about the policy developments in state-owned enterprises governance since 1990s. The challenge is that we have about 8 speakers, and we have only 2 hours. And immediately after this session, we have a tea break and one more session. As you know, in the forenoon session, in spite of the number of speakers, we were able to keep to the time and start on time and end on time. But of course, we had more time then. But this time we have probably as many speakers and probably almost half the time. Well, good. I'm sure we can meet the challenge. Now, my pleasant responsibility now is to welcome the speakers and discussants. May I now invite Dr. Y.R.K. Reddy to the stage, please. Dr. Reddy is our collaborator from the Academy of Corporate Governance, Hyderabad, India. And he's an international resource person in corporate governance and policy with work spanning 30 countries and several international bodies. He was formerly ONGC Chair Professor of Strategic Management, Administrative Staff College of India, and has been a featured columnist and author of the first principles of corporate governance for state-owned enterprises. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Y.R.K. Reddy. Thank you, Dr. Reddy. And our next speaker is Mr. Alec Aaltonen. Mr. Aaltonen would give us a flavor. Mr. Aaltonen, please. Mr. Aaltonen will give us a flavor of the trends in the Middle East. He's a professional in the Hakama Institute of Corporate Governance. He has substantial experience with the boards of listed companies and has done substantial analysis in corporate governance of banks, financial services, etc. He's an expert in international commercial law. Please welcome Dr. Aaltonen. Our third speaker this afternoon is Dr. Mohammad Rizal Salim. Dr. Salim is a professor. Dr. Salim, please. He's a professor in the Institute of Nottingham, Malaysia campus. He's a prolific writer in corporate governance and company law and has authored many articles and case studies on socio-legal perspectives of Malaysian economic policies and company law reforms. Please welcome Dr. Salim. Our next speaker is Mr. Dag Detter. Mr. Detter, please. Mr. Detter is from Sweden. He is currently the CEO of Detter and Company, specializing in state assets. He was previously the president of the Statum, the Swedish government holding company, and a director at the Ministry of Industry. He led the first deep-rooted transformation of state-owned enterprises in Europe, the Swedish government's 60 billion euro commercial portfolio. Dr. Detter, please welcome. Well, we also have 4 discussants who will be interacting. They will be, of course, giving us a little bit of their views also, but they will also be commenting on the points made by the speakers. And we have Mr. Philip. Some of the discussants will be coming as speakers tomorrow or maybe in the later sessions also. So you'll be hearing more from them later. We have Mr. Philip T. and Co. Mr. Co? Yes. Mr. Co is a professional from the law domain. He has worked extensively with the Global Corporate Governance Forum and is the founder board member of the Malaysian Institute of Corporate Governance. He is currently a senior partner with Mrs. Ma Kamaria and Philip Co., a leading law firm having strength in corporate securities laws, cross-border investments, corporate finance, and banking. Please welcome Dr. Co once again, please. Next we have Dr. Otiu Igbuzor. Dr. Igbuzor, please. Dr. Igbuzor is the Executive Director of the African Center for Leadership, Strategy and Development. He works as Honorable Commissioner in the Police Service Commission and has published many scholarly articles. He is a Fellow of the Nigerian Institute of Strategic Management. Mr. Igbuzor, please welcome once again. Mr. Radhakrishnan, my colleague, is the chairman of the Jawaharlal Nehru Port Trust, Mumbai, and is a member of the Indian Administrative Service from the Kerala cadre. He has served as Secretary of the Ministry of Industries in Kerala, Ministry of Ports, Power, and so on. And he has made substantial contribution to the development of the traditional industry sector in Kerala. He has international exposure, especially in Northern Europe. Mr. Radhakrishnan. Well, our last but not the least, most important person for this afternoon is Mr. K. Chandran Pillai. Mr. Pillai is a former member of the Indian Parliament, and he is a senior experienced trade union leader with keen interest in policy matters related to industry. He has always been in the forefront of initiatives on the hinged on states' involvement with the federal government. He has done specific works on the impact of WTO regime. Mr. Pillai, please. Friends, that's the lineup today, and what we have is about 15 minutes each for the speakers and about 10 minutes for the discussants. So may I now invite Dr. Reddy, please.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be again in Kerala and being associated with the state-owned enterprises with which I have been associated for the last 2 decades off and on. And as the chair has pointed out, it is indeed a challenge to manage what we have to say in the time that is given, and I will try flag a few disjointed points and hopefully even save a couple of minutes for the chair to allocate elsewhere. We have heard about the history of the entire state-owned enterprises and so on from the morning session, but primarily I would like to flag the issue that soon after the 1950s and 60s, which had shown tremendous growth in the East European model in terms of the industrial growth, the employment growth, and the GDP growth, it had become a kind of a model that everyone else, every other country had to follow, and they were following primarily in the absence of the private capital, reluctance of the private enterprises to come into the picture, and the tendency of the private enterprises to monopolize the markets. And in those circumstances, even India had got into the act of inviting state-owned enterprises to be set up in different parts of the country and in strategic areas. And the same thing happened all over the world, the honeymoon with the state-owned enterprises, the financing of the state-owned enterprises, particularly in the strategic and critical areas, for example, of ensuring food security, fertilizer security, and such other, was known and noted. What exactly has probably happened later on, we all know that there has been a disenchantment and disaffection with the state-owned enterprises for multiple reasons, including of ideological preferences. With the result, there has been some sort of a run on the state-owned enterprises, if I may say, something like the run on the deposits in a bank when the confidence loses in the bank. So there has been a kind of a run in the state-owned enterprises, mass-scale privatization, mass-scale disinvestment, and getting rid of everything that was state-owned enterprises, very sadly so. And this backlash, or let's say disaffection with the state-owned enterprises, has been all through the world, and I may point out it was particularly so in the Latin American countries, which during the 90s accounted for nearly 50% of the global revenues after privatization. Whereas Asia and Africa were not privatizing that hard, the Latin American nations were very, very quick in privatization and garnered up to 50% of the global revenues of privatization. So that was the level of disenchantment. And the amount of privatization went to some extent in those countries where even water was getting privatized. And we all know the kind of things that have happened in Bolivia, for example, where water was privatized. There were issues of every poor person having to spend 1/3 of his monthly salary to just purchase water. And they were prevented from even collecting the rainwater because there were rights over the rainwater. Those were the extents to which things went ahead. But then, soon thereafter, we have seen that there was some sort of a backlash, primarily as the economist pointed out, for a various number of reasons. For many years, people thought that the state-owned enterprises were half-formed creatures, as the economists say. But then a combination of factors that has arisen, ideological, fiscal, various other things, and the experiences amongst the state-owned enterprises themselves have pointed out that there was no way but to strengthen the state-owned enterprises. And it will be very useful for those of us who are gathered here to look at the November 11th issue of The Economist, which talks about that China buying up the world. There are very important statements, and there's a usage of the term resurgence of state capitalism. Resurgence of state capitalism as a term which has been used in this conference and even earlier as well to validate the need for strengthening the state-owned enterprises at this particular stage. The backlash has taken some of these countries to the other extreme of nationalizing and garnering up of these private enterprises once again, what had happened many, many years ago. For example, in Venezuela, in recent years, the Holcim and the Lafarge, the two private enterprises, have been nationalized, same as the Banco de Venezuela. In Bolivia, there is a ban on the foreign exchange transfers, and you find several other decrees that have been issued in many parts of the world to ensure the resurgence and reassertion of the state-owned enterprises and the need for state intervention. As was pointed out in the morning, we have noted that in the United States of America, the bastion of the capitalism and the market forces, they also have come to a moderate approach to know that when things are going from bad to worse, the private enterprises neatly hands over the issue to the state. And it has gone on like in cycles over a period of years, where whenever the market fails, the state intervenes. And state comes in, intervenes in terms of the finances, in terms of the bailouts, and so on and so forth. And rightly so, many people say that these kinds of events lead to privatization of gains for many years, and suddenly when the losses occurs, the socialization of losses. And this cannot be pointed out anymore than underscoring what has happened in the United States, not only the General Motors bailout, but other types of bailouts that we have seen. Even as the financial sector is being compensated about 27% more, even during the crisis time, you will find there is a wage-free rest of the economy, and it looks like the private sector particularly has been very clever in capturing the governments many other countries as well. To the extent so much that people believe now whether the G20 coming together and bailing out various countries and infusing of capital, whether at the back of it all was there a ploy by all these private enterprises which have been making losses to socialize the losses by ensuring the governmental intervention and the infusion of finances as long as they are going to be safe eventually after the cycle is over. Not getting more and more into that, but let me summarize to say there that the entire 90s has seen there's a tremendous amount of attraction to privatization and disengagement with the SOEs from 90 to 95 or so, but from 95 onwards there has been a backlash, disaffection with the entire process, and what was promised to be a J curve has turned out to be an inverted V curve, in the sense that the J curve stood for the hope in the earlier years that when you privatize something, it will dip in profits, but very soon pick up and the growth will be very high. But the experience has shown that a little bit of growth, but very steep fall in most of the experience in most of the countries has been the lesson of the 1990s. Having said that, I would also like to flag, rather than look at the past, as to what is happening in the state-owned enterprises in my experience across the world and where it is converging probably. One is a distinct approach throughout the world, China, Malaysia, Singapore, name it, all the world, to ensure that all the state-owned enterprises become a portfolio rather than single units or a transaction, which means that there is a consolidation probably that is happening around the world of the state-owned enterprises being bundled together as a portfolio, either under a special purpose vehicle or a holding company, or even as a policy of the state. That is a distinctive approach, and associated with it is the kind of a shift from looking at the ideological need for the state-owned enterprises to enhancing the value. So in the context of the enhancement of the value of the state-owned assets as a portfolio, some of the strategies that are being followed all over the world are in terms of partial disinvestment, even as the state controls the enterprises. To that extent, you will find that the minor disinvestment of 5%, 7%, 10% is being followed in many other countries, or many countries including our own. And there are also, once they are publicly listed, there are rules that say that X amount of money must be floating in the market, consequent to which there might be further disinvestment, yet in the governmental control, yet in the governmental hold. And associated with that is the employees' involvement in the stake options. Many countries have benefited in the process. That is something that is going on as a trend. The second that I would like to flag here is increasing urgency in re-engineering the relationship between the state and the state-owned enterprises. Many people say state-owned enterprises must carry on as a governmental activity. The simple fact is, once the government decides that it shall not be part of the sovereign function of the state, but it shall be corporatized into a company form, a legal form, it has a legal entity. And it has to be treated and respected and nurtured as a separate entity rather than as a sovereign function of the state, as a part of the state. If it were required to be part of the state, it should have been part of the state rather than corporatized. So understanding this kind of a logic, people are trying to say, how do we restructure so that the government does what it shall do as an owner? It is the owner, ultimate owner, and there is no dispute about it. But the relationship between an owner, the board of directors, and the management, you need clarity, need transparency, and so that there is greater accountability. And this is where most of the world is going on in terms of restructuring the relationship. The last is an important point that we must recognize. The manner in which we understood the state-owned enterprises all these years has changed. Today, state-owned enterprises not only limit to the enterprise as a company, but also capital. There is a state capital. Sovereign wealth funds have come about in the last 10 years very, very drastically. Many countries all over the world, including Venezuela, Singapore, Malaysia, they have the state-owned enterprises, they have the SPVs, but which are also acting as sovereign wealth funds. What does it mean? Like the Chinese wealth funds are today conquering and bidding and acquiring various companies all over the world. In the Volvo car that we know today, it doesn't belong to Volvo anymore. The Volvo belongs to Geely, which is the Chinese firm. And the Chinese are bidding for Rio Tinto, Unocal, etc. All this money is arising from the sovereign wealth funds, which is the state money, which is the state capital. So what is emerging is a kind of a state capitalism, which is being furthered beyond the borders and through various indirect means of backroom deals and so on. So when we discuss about state-owned enterprises, state capitalism, requirements of the state, we also have to look at the new paradigm where the state capital moves across the borders and very, very differently to acquire some stakes, small or big, in various forms of the corporate world. And Chinese have certainly led the way. And Indians are far, far behind this kind of, let's say, state capitalism or state capitalism further through state sovereign wealth funds. I will stop there and hopefully have time to catch up with any of the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy. We will now move on to listen to Mr.-elect Aaltonen. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for organizing such a very important and timely event. Obviously, governance of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, is very topical on the global scale, and not least because of the government bailouts in the West, where we have seen what can be characterized as, at least to some extent, nationalization without representation. But in the Middle East and North Africa, or MENA for short, MENA region, policymakers are increasingly focusing on good corporate governance as a way of making the region's SOEs more efficient. And I'm very happy to be participating in this conference today, as we are certainly looking to learn from experience in other countries when we are tackling our governance challenges. But let me just briefly introduce Haukama Institute of Corporate Governance to you. We were set up in 2006 by a number of international organizations such as the OECD, the International Finance Corporation, World Bank, the Union Arab Banks, and the Dubai Financial Center. The idea is that for corporate governance to take root in the region, a regional institution was needed to work on the ground to formulate corporate governance policies that take into account the region's realities and are homegrown. We work both on the regulatory level and the company level, meaning that we offer technical advice to regulators, ministries, capital market authorities, etc. We drafted some of the corporate governance codes in the Gulf region. We advise companies on their corporate governance arrangements, and we provide professional development programs on corporate governance for boards of directors. This slide tries to capture what we are trying to do. But in terms of our policy work, we have a number of, we typically work by setting up task forces in which we bring in together international organizations, international experts, the region's regulators, as well as the industry. Currently we have 6 task forces. The insurance, the insolvency, the bank task forces have already produced their policy briefs with detailed recommendations for regulators and companies as to how to go about improving corporate governance. The Islamic Finance Task Force and the Private Equity Task Force policy briefs are currently being finalized. And we have the State-Owned Enterprise Task Force, which I will be talking about shortly. But let me just give you a little background of what SOEs, the nature of SOEs in the MENA region. It's sometimes forgotten how diverse the MENA region is, and this diversity is reflected in the region's SOEs. Just in terms of numbers, certain countries have a relatively low number of SOEs. There are 30 in Bahrain, 26 in the UAE, while Egypt has some 159, and Iraq has close to 180. Of course, the number doesn't really say much about their size or importance, but it's clear that the SOEs represent a significant part in terms of assets, value added, and GDP. And this is despite of the privatization programs. They continue to dominate many of the economies in the regions. Of course, there are variations, like countries like Yemen, they are highly dependent